But we're continuing this series. We're finishing up today the series of looking at the impact of the resurrection on people immediately following the gift of the Spirit being given to the followers of Jesus after his ascension back into heaven. And so we've been talking about a couple of key characters, but it all kind of centers off of this key verse. I'll tell you about that in a second. Right here from Acts chapter 1. But you will receive power when the Holy Spirit comes upon you. You will be my witnesses, telling people about me everywhere, in Jerusalem, throughout Judea, in Samaria, and to the ends of the earth. So today we're covering that final category, the ends of the earth, looking at the furthest stretches of the witnessing of the gospel in the book of Acts. But before we dive into the topic today, just a reminder, over the summer we're going to have a couple of sessions of Bible studies here in the sanctuary after worship for 45 minutes, 10:45 to 11:30. We'll get to walk through the books of the Bible that we'll be studying over the course of those weeks. And we're putting a sign up together for this, but it's just something to put on your radar. Over the summer, while you're here, we'd love to have you join us in discussion around the books of the Bible we'll be studying. And the reason for that is you can only preach one sermon at a time. And there's a lot of content in the Bible, and we're only going to be spending 2 weeks on any particular book, and you're only going to get 2 sermons on any particular book. And there's a lot more than that in those pages. And so the invitation is to be reading through these books together. And I promise you can get through a book of the Bible in 2 weeks, okay? We'll do it together. And as you read, you're going to underline things or highlight things or question things. And the invitation is bring those thoughts and questions and notes into the conversation, and we'll have a chance to grow together over the course of the summer. So a few weeks before the 4th of July, at the end of May and all of June. And then after the 4th of July, we'll come back before the start of the school year for a few weeks as well. So like I said, we'll have a sign up for that ready soon, but just be thinking about that as a possibility to grow in faith without needing to take 2 trips to church during the week. You could just stay here. Not sure why that was so funny. So again, we're talking about this mission that God's people received as they heard about the impact of the resurrection. And it broke into 3 categories. Jerusalem throughout Judea, the immediate surrounding place of Jesus' ministry. Samaria, significant because the Samaritans were known as being, or the Samaritans, were known as being outside of the covenant of God. They were viewed as outsiders and less than by those who were within Jerusalem. And then finally to the ends of the earth. These people didn't have any kind of connection into the body of God's people, and yet they are receiving the message about Jesus. We looked at Peter, and remember Peter was preaching in the temple square, and his message with the other apostles was we must obey God. It's a humble trust to go where he leads because Jesus is the Messiah, and the Messiah is that special word meaning anointed one. And yeah, he was promised to a specific people that most of us are not a part of, by the way. And so the initial message was to those who were a part of that old covenant, letting them know that Jesus was the one they were looking for, no matter what it cost. The people sending that message, they were locked up, they were punished, they were beaten, and yet it still was important to them to obey God and share the good news that Jesus is the Messiah. And we heard about Philip, and Philip's message to us was that we need to share the good news wherever we go, wherever that person might be, whenever we are sent. Knowing that someone may have a starting point of great familiarity with the Scriptures. Maybe they even were raised within a spiritual home, and yet they're still distanced from God, and you might have the opportunity to bring that connection closer for them. Or maybe they've got no background whatsoever. They're starting from nothing, and that's still a place that we can be with them in sharing the good news about Jesus as the one God promised. Now, today we're hearing about Paul. So we heard about Peter, we heard about Philip. Today we're hearing about Paul. Would you read this with me, the large letters up there? His purpose was for the nations to seek after God and perhaps feel their way toward him and find him, though he is not far from any one of us. Now, a couple of things might jump out at you here. First of all, his purpose was for the nations to seek after God, his purpose being God's purpose. Well, the word the nations there, the Greek there is a word that specifically is describing anyone that is not within God's covenant people. Anyone that's not a part of the Israelite nation, the children of Abraham. The nations there just means any other kind of ethnicity, any other kind of person. That is God's God's purpose was for all of those people to seek after him as well. He didn't choose his people to exclude everyone else, but that through them, he would establish a connection with all people, and they should seek and find their way toward him because he's not far from any one of us. This is Paul's mission. And so we pick up the narrative here. Paul is in Athens, and he has traveled there and been in conversation with people in the synagogue, in the marketplace, anywhere that he could find them. And they were conversing, and we pick up the narrative as he is in discussion with some of those people. So Paul, standing before the council, addressed them as follows. Men of Athens, I notice that you are very religious in every way. That was a compliment to them. For as I was walking along, I saw your many shrines, and one of your altars had this inscription on it, to an unknown God. This God whom you worship without knowing is the one I'm telling you about. He is the God who made the world and everything in it, since he is the Lord of heaven and earth. He doesn't live in man-made temples, and human hands can't serve his needs, for he has no needs. He himself gives life and breath to everything, and he satisfies every need. From one man he created all the nations throughout the whole earth. He decided beforehand where they should rise and fall, and he determined their boundaries. This description of God as the ultimate authority and source of life. His purpose was for the nations to seek after God and perhaps feel their way toward him and find him, though he is not far from any one of us. For in him we live and move and exist. As some of your own poets have said, we are his offspring. And since this is true, we shouldn't think of God as an idol designed by craftsmen from gold or silver or stone. God overlooked people's ignorance about these things in earlier times, but now he commands everyone, everywhere, to repent of their sins and turn to him. For he has set a day for judging the world with justice by the man he has appointed. It's Jesus. And he proved to everyone who this is by raising him from the dead. There's a lot of content in there. But it's important for us to recognize, we'll finish up here. When they heard Paul speak about the resurrection of the dead, some laughed in contempt. Others said, we want to hear more about this later. And that ended Paul's discussion with them, but some joined him and became believers. That's an important detail as well. There's a few things I want to point out to you about Paul's method here in terms of communicating the hope that he has through Jesus. And first of all, the important thing to notice is that Paul's method is all based on this, a heart for the lost. His greatest desire is for the lost to find their way toward God and be connected to him and recognize that all of their needs in life have been satisfied by him and will continue to be satisfied by him. But life is made more full when you're aware of who is doing the satisfaction and provision, who is the source of life and the provider of all the things that we need. Remember, he describes God's attitude toward humanity this way. God's purpose was for all people, the nations, to seek after him, perhaps feel their way toward him and find him, though he's not far from any one of us. Sometimes I think when we talk about God's attitude toward humanity, sometimes we tend to describe it with a little bit of a threatening tone, right? Well, you better turn toward God because he's going to hold you accountable if you don't. But how often have we heard this tone described in God's hope? His design, his purpose, his desire is to be found by people as they search for the truth. When I was putting this sermon series together, this was really the heart of everything that I wanted to communicate to you. The truth is true no matter what you think or feel about it. The truth is true. And so if someone is looking for the truth and they've discovered maybe something that's actually false, the more that they press into that and push against that and test that, they're going to eventually discover that there's a lack of integrity there. There's falseness in whatever it is that they have latched onto. And if that breaks on them, they're going to continue searching. And eventually, they will have to find the truth that doesn't break, the truth that is actually true, the truth of God, who is the creator of the universe, the sustainer of all things, who without him we wouldn't even have woken up with breath in our lungs this morning. He is the one that is purposeful toward his desire for all people to find their way toward him. And so that was the heart of the whole sermon series. God sent Peter to describe who it is that links us to God in Jesus. Philip describes this attitude of being willing to meet someone no matter where they are. And Paul describes God's attitude toward us as being this merciful, patient, and persistent invitation for people to find their way toward God. But he uses some really interesting strategies in his sermon to the Athenians. First of all, as we mentioned, his heart is for the lost. Prior to that long sermon to the Athenian council, this is what Luke writes in the book of Acts. He says, while Paul was waiting for them in Athens, he was deeply troubled by all the idols he saw everywhere in the city. Right off the bat, as he arrives in Athens, the first thing that happens is his heart is troubled. He is concerned. He's heartbroken for people who are chasing after these false things. These people who are being pulled into directions that are going to leave them empty and can't actually provide for any of their needs. So he goes to the synagogue to reason with the Jews and the God-fearing Gentiles. He speaks daily in the public square to all who happen to be there. He had a debate with the Epicurean and the Stoic philosophers. Those are two schools of thought that are opposed to each other. So he's talking to everybody. He's telling them about Jesus and his resurrection. And when he says that, they respond with what's this babbler trying to say? With these strange ideas he's picked up. Others say he seems to be preaching about some foreign gods, and they take him to the high council of the city. Come and tell us about this new teaching, they said. You're saying some rather strange things. We want to know what it's all about. And then Luke includes this parenthetical comment. He says it should be explained that all the Athenians, as well as the foreigners in Athens, seem to spend all their time discussing the latest ideas. And then we get into the reading that you saw today on the screen. I don't know about you when you hear that, but as I was reading it, I can't help but notice some striking parallels between the Athens of Paul's day and the culture in which I live. Because it seems like the only thing anyone really cares about is what the latest idea happens to be, right? How often are we caught up in conversations simply about the latest ideas, wanting to know what this person thought about that or your reaction to this particular opinion, and we're always comparing and talking about ideas, and the truth is, we also kind of are caught up in an idolatry ourselves. Before we get into that, I just want to mention that Paul had these great points. First of all, he recognized an opportunity to introduce the gospel. If you go back to the beginning of this reading, Paul's standing before the council, and the first thing he says is, you are very religious people. You are interested in spiritual things. You are discussing the divine, and I noticed you're worshiping a God who you haven't yet known. You haven't yet named. Paul is an opportunistic thinker. He looks and he finds an opportunity to say, this is a place where the truth might be presented. He also is referencing secular poets and ideas. Right here in verse 28, in him we live and move and exist. In many translations, that would be in quotations as well. That's a reference to an ancient poem. We are his offspring, another reference to this ancient idea that there's a spark of the divine within every human being. And I know that sounds kind of like off the wall, a little bit kind of broadly spiritualistic for us, but Paul is seeing an opportunity for us to recognize that people are looking for the truth. And so he takes that opportunity to introduce them to the truth that's revealed in Jesus. He establishes what he means by God. He describes God as the creator, the sustainer of all things, the provider of everything that we need, the one above all else, against whom none can stand. And then he introduces Jesus right here in verse 31. He has appointed one to bring judgment, and he proved who it was by bringing him back from the dead. He introduces Jesus to them, even though they were on their way to finding God with little success on their own. They had stopped along the way and built shrines and built temples and built idols, and that's where they stopped on their spiritual journey. They never made it all the way, and so Jesus comes into the world to introduce God to us in a personal way. And Paul sees this, and he recognizes where these Athenians are and says, I know the missing piece here for your picture of spirituality, and his name is Jesus. And he's willing to endure contempt for the possibility that some might believe. And that's another element that sometimes we forget. We talked about that last week, right? We kind of avoid the opportunities we have to share the reason for our faith or the faith that we have in general because it's a little bit uncomfortable when we're not sure if the person we're sharing it with is on the same page as us, even though we know that we're supposed to share it with people that aren't on the same page so they can be brought into the church. But Paul is willing to endure the contempt. Some joined him and became believers. Some laughed in contempt at him, but Paul was willing to share the truth. What's driving Paul's message? A heart for the lost, that some might be found. And Paul bases it all on this attitude of God, inviting those to come find him and come experience the truth. Now, I would love to give you a course on evangelism right now, but I think it's important, first of all, for us to hear Paul's message spoken to us. So I've got a couple of guiding questions for you. And the first one is, if Paul were to walk through your home, here's where the trick question comes around. What altars or idols might he find there? You might say, well, John, I don't have any idols in my house, okay? I don't have some shrine in the back that I go and pray to, and I'm not casting, tea leaves or burning incense to deities. I'm not an idolater, okay? But if he's walking through and he sees, a giant TV with a prominent positioning, all the furniture pointed toward it, he might think, well, this seems like an altar to entertainment to me, an altar to entertainment. It's funny, but think about it, Or if he sees a schedule or calendar that everything flows into and out of, he might think, well, this looks like it might be the altar to control, the altar to planning. Maybe it's framed awards and credentials, little sanctuaries of the altar of achievement, right? An accomplishment, the things you've done. Possessions behind glass or locked behind doors, little pockets of greed that nobody else is allowed to touch except for you. And that's your happy place. That's the place you can go. Where would Paul identify an idol or an altar in your home? And obviously this can be taken too far, right? The answer is not, your home is not made more Christian simply by putting up Christian posters everywhere and eliminating everything else from your house, right? And throwing it all in the dumpster. But pay attention. This is the invitation. We have to pay attention to when we walk through our home. We have put things there. Consciously or unconsciously, we have established a world in which we live and spend our time, and that conditions us to think a certain way, to think about certain things or about certain people or look at certain things. And the real question is, what is it that you value most? What is it that you worship? What is it that you turn to when you are just burned out? What is it that you turn to in times of celebration? Where do you go when you just need to disconnect, when you need to get out of your own head? What is it that you turn to? Because that oftentimes is the idol. And God gives us many things in life to help with decompression, to help with disconnection, to help with relaxation, to help with social connection, with encouragement, with answering the questions and wrestling with the difficulties in life. But if any of them eclipses the position that he holds as the one who gave it all to us, before we turn to him, before we invite him into that conversation or that activity or that reflection time, we've erased his name from the altar and we've left it blank and we've put something else there. We all have idols in our homes. We all have idols in our hearts. But Paul's word to you would simply be, today is the day that God is calling you. Today is the day that you can look at those idols that you have put up in your home or in your heart and you can say, I'm going to listen to God's voice. I'm going to turn to him because I know and I've heard maybe for my whole life who Jesus is. And every day is a struggle to become more like him. We all are going to falter and fail all the time. But Paul would say today is the day. God is calling out to you, walk with him. Because the idols in your life will only drain you of the life that Jesus calls you to live. They're only going to pull you away from the things that God has given that bring life. So if it's a TV show and you've got to get through the episode and you won't put it on pause and, your 10-week-old is crying and maybe I'm talking to me. Pay attention to the idols. Let today be the day that you aren't pulled away from the life Jesus promises, because it's impossible to live a life-filled life without him. Now, Paul, in his description of God, actually, and it's great for our context, Paul turns to creation as his initial introduction to who God is. The one responsible for all this that you see, the world around you, the people that you're connected to, the nature that you walk through, he is the one that is connecting to you through this one named Jesus. And you and I live in a beautiful place, and so we can go and engage with the creation that God has made, and let that be our reminder. My simple one-step encouragement to helping to step away from your idols is just to get outside and pray. Just go outside and pray. Say thank you for the mountains. Thank you for the hummingbirds. Thank you for the artificial turf. Thank you for that too. It's prettier than dead grass, Not as eco-friendly, but God gives us opportunities to connect with him in what may seem like trivial ways, but it's in these little ways. It's in these little ways that we start to chip away at the idols we've put in our lives and reestablish the life-giving connection that only he can provide. And when you're doing that, you start to engage in what then happens as the people who believe in God's gifts for us. Jesus' mission is shared through you and I when we engage in the life that he promises. Whether it be a knit little cross, a Bible buddy. We have some ladies at church that have knit hundreds of these little Bible buddies. If you'd like one, please let me know. They would love to give you a dozen. That's something to keep in your pocket when you walk around. You notice something beautiful, a flower or any element of creation, and you can say, God, thank you for that. Thank you for the opportunity I have just to enjoy that. Help me to remember that even when I'm not in the presence of beautiful things, even when I'm not in a perfectly tranquil environment, even when I'm not able to lift myself up out of the difficulties and the doubts and the darkness that this life so often hinders us with, help me to see you. Help me to turn to you. Help me to spend my time looking for your wisdom and trusting in your promises and letting you lead me through that. And if you happen to be outside while you're doing this, pay attention, because someone just might ask you what you're doing. And now you have an opportunity to answer them truthfully. Well, I came out here to pray. I came out here to say thanks for what God has given. I came out here because I don't want to get lost into the empty things that promise relief, the empty things that pull me away from the most important people in my life. And then you participate in the mission of sharing the good news about Jesus with others. And that's how God gets his message to the ends of the earth. That's why any of us really have the faith that's in our hearts. It was shared either with us or with someone in our family, and we are brought into this community by his work. The whole point of this series is that Jesus' resurrection from the dead matters to you. It matters to me. Because it's through the resurrection that God the Father vindicated or proved true everything that Jesus said. And Jesus said, in this world you will have trouble, but I've overcome this world. Jesus said, in me there is life. I am a spring of living water. Jesus' promises count for you because he was raised from the dead. Trust in that. Go back to that. Remind yourself and the other people in your life of that truth. It can feel so distant and abstract to think about an event that happened 2,000 years ago. But God's promise to us is that each day that can have an impact, each day that can bring life for us. Would you pray with me? God, we struggle with idols. We struggle with distraction. We have a hard time hearing your voice, turning to you. But we know that you're merciful. Turn our hearts and shape us into a people that turn to you first, that trust you in the good times and the bad times. And use us like you used your servant Paul to invite others into the journey of seeking you out, that the truth of who you are would stand the test of time and pressure and difficulty, and that those who are lost will be brought into a gracious connection with your love. In Jesus' name, amen.